Welcome back to our military history, and today we have an absolute treat for you. It's an interview with the esteemed Peter Caddick-Adams. I'm absolutely thrilled that he's offered to come on board and do a little interview with me today. If you like and subscribe to this video, Peter will very, very kindly send you a copy of his latest book, Sand and Steel, all about Normandy 1944. So if you like this video and comment in the box below, I'll pick a name out of the hat at the end of the month. We'll get that sent to you. So that's a lovely little prize giveaway there from Peter, and I want to thank him again.
And I will sign and dedicate it to. So there
thank
we
you
are.
so much. The first question I'd like to ask you is there a defining moment that set you on the path to become the historian that you are today?
I think there always is with every historian, and chatting through. There's always, I think, a moment. It's not something you drift into. What we love doing is unique. It comes from the heart. It's a vocation. It's something I think a lot of us feel we were born to do. There's something about having a connectivity with the past that is really important. And you probably feel the same.
Yeah.
And those listening
definitely
to us today probably feel the same. And probably we can all reach back to a moment. For me, I can tell you the day. It was 22nd of November, 1970, which was my 10th birthday. So giving away all the secrets there. My mother took me to see the film The Battle of Britain, and that had been released just the previous year. So it was an outing to the cinema. And I loved the Spitfires and Messerschmitts diving around through the sky. But she took me because she had been 10 when the battle was fought, and she wanted me to understand what life was like for her at my age. Wow. And we got home, and then there was great opening of birthday presents, and two of the presents were plastic model kits. And one was from a company called Revell, and another was from a company called Frog. But they were like Airfix kits, and they were two Airfix type planes to make. Neither was a Spitfire. That came the following day. But so it was the coincidence of the Battle of Britain hitting me square between the eyes, followed up by two plastic model kits. Yeah. And I went back to give the prizes at my prep school a few years ago, and the art master, who was still there, introduced me, and he said, I can remember the time when Peter came back from the cinema, and you knew what he was going to do with his life, because whatever we told him to do in art, a Spitfire and a Messerschmitt would appear in the painting or on the drawing he had to do. So I didn't realize that the die was cast then, but that's what it was. And then hard on the heels of Airfix came Action Man and Dinky Toys, and then eventually I went off and became a soldier, and made sense of all those bits and pieces I'd seen and played with much earlier.
No, it's incredible, like that you say about the Britain, because I grew up in Biggin Hill, so I was right under the flight path there.
Oh, goodness me! So
yeah,
it's all part of it.
Yeah, it really is.
And those were sort of heady days, and I don't want to sort of sound old-fashioned, but we had a factory in North Staffordshire, and everyone was of an age where they had done national service, and most had fought in the Second World War. So they all kept their army boots, and they wore those into work. A lot had berets, so that was their working beret to stop their sort of head getting really dirty. And they all brought their lunch, which they called snapping, into work with them in a Second World War 1940 gas mask case.
Incredible.
The sort of things Tommies had to put over their shoulders in 1940, the first one that we sort of saw that they wore on their chest. And these were still retained into the 70s and 80s by people for their lunch. So actually, wherever you looked, there was a tiny little sliver of the Second World War. I mean, when I went into the CCF at my school, not far away from where you are now at Shrewsbury, we still had battle dress, and we had 38 pattern webbing. which of
Wow.
course we had to blanco and polish
Hmm.
and keep it. So, that was the 1940s Army straight away, which just hadn't changed at all. So the first rifle I ever trained on was an SMLE 303-inch caliber weapon. So it's all gone now, but that was Montgomery's army that had not
Yes.
quite finished. And I think that really carried on until 1991 was the first Gulf War, when everything suddenly became modern and very integrated.
Yeah.
But until then, some of the reserve units of the British Army still had 25-pounders.
Oh, wow.
So that
Fair enough.
throwback to the Second World War was still there, surprisingly late, and that's what I grew up with. The CCF sergeant major at my school had dropped into Arnhem,
Wow.
and he was one of the last people who was serving in uniform in some capacity, who had still parachuted into Arnhem, whatever it was, 35, 40 years earlier. And that's
incredible.
exactly what it was like.
Wow. So that might lead into the next question. Who or what would you say has been the biggest influence on your career?
I sort of knew I always wanted to write about military history. And so one of the things I did was I started at a very early age, I was interested in military affairs. That ended up with me going to Sandhurst and joining a regiment of the British Army. Then I joined the TA. And I was also, really interested in the academic side of military history. And I took myself off and I did a degree at the University of Wolverhampton, good old Wolverhampton, and their War Studies course, which is still going strong, presided over by John Buckley, who was, I was older than him, but he was teaching me. I'd already put the nuts and bolts together. He put it in order. So he taught me how to look at military history in an academic way. And of course, now there is Gary Sheffield there as well, great First World War guru. But the head of the Territorial Army at the time was a man whose name is known to most of us, Richard Holmes.
Yes.
And so I used to come across him in a lot of Territorial Army events. And I said, to him, how did you get to where you are academically? What can I do? Essentially, when I graduated with in war studies at Wolverhampton, Richard was kind enough to sort of take me under his wing and say, right, what you need to do is come and work for me at the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham, and we'll find a post for you as a lecturer there. And that was it. So I was Richard Holmes's sort of sponsor. He was my sponsor, and he really was my, almost my uncle, certainly my friend, colleague, and mentor from then until his death. I miss him daily, and I always think of him just sort of peering over my shoulder, telling me what to read or whatever. And of course, our great thing was that we both loved doing battlefield tours and staff rides.
Yeah, I mean his War Walk series and his Battlefield series are just
and it was at the time when he was, by the time he died, he'd written over 30 books.
I know, incredible.
And there was a Renaissance man of sort of, Winston Churchill sort of proportions in terms of, the number of different interests he had. So he was my professor as head of my department, but he was also my brigadier as head of the Territorial Army. He found time to be a justice of the peace. He wrote his book. He was writing his books. He was doing his television programs. And in between all of those, he did battlefield tours and lectures on cruise ships. And so I used to do some of those with him. And I had done battlefield tours before, but he really taught me the craft of walking the ground, and of course instilled in me what I'd already realized, which is you can't write about military history unless you've walked those fields yourself and you've come up with your own conclusions and rolled around in the surf on Omaha Beach and waded through the mud on the Somme, just so you get a feel of what it was like. One thing I never really did, and I sort of regret it, was learnt to ride a horse, and that was another passion of Richard's. He loved Thatch, his horse, which used to appear in as many war walks as possible.
Yes.
Largely because he could then put him down for tax purposes as an employee. But
Oh, that's
he
incredible.
sort of said he rode the retreat of the British Army from Mons to Le Cateau, and then Le Cateau back. And it came out as a wonderful book called Riding the Retreat. But he said the interesting thing is when you rode that, after a while you got dirty and muddy and mucky because you mucked out and looked after your horse every night.
Yeah.
And after a while you gave up worrying about how messy you looked or felt. And that was very much the sort of British Army in retreat. And he said it gave him insights into what it was like being with the army in that retreat in Mons in 1914. But also, that really struck home with me. And it gave you a sense of what it was like to be the part of the British Expeditionary Force in 1940, fleeing before the Germans going back to Dunkirk, or indeed the Americans in the Ardennes in 1944, reeling back in those first few days when, your first thought is to preserve yourself. And actually you get, hungry, cold, tired, all the rest of it. And you don't really care about how you look. And it's really important, I think, to sort of get into the mind of a soldier before you write about them. And that's what brings military history alive. And that's what I hope I managed to do.
Richard Holmes was he was my hero when I was growing up. I didn't get into football till I was like 15 or so, but Richard Holmes, if I'd had a poster of him on my wall, I would have. Had the honor of meeting him when he released the Churchill book. And he said to me, "Oh, you must be the youngest person I've ever given a lecture to." And he shook my hand.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and I don't think I washed that hand for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. He was just.
I think what he meant to us all was that he was a great communicator.
Yeah.
And a lot of people I meet who have a passion in military history, they are collectors of things. And it could be swords or medals or badges or uniforms or facts about tanks. And that's stage one, but it's only stage one. And it's not enough to do history for its own sake. It's putting all of those together and making some sense of them. So what do the badges tell you about the evolution of the British Army or the swords? What does that tell you about the evolution of tactics? And so it was those little nuggets and insights that we used to trade all the time. And that's why I think, he was very valuable for all of us because he brought military history out of what I would call anorakdom.
Yeah, he did.
Very respectfully. And took it away from just being a passion of white middle-aged men who collected things and made it wider, but also made it relevant.
Yeah.
So it might be that, we would go off and talk and discuss and walk the ground of Heinz Guderian and his Panzer Corps crossing the River Meuse in May 1940 at Sedan. But that's the kind of exercise the British Army was having to do in Germany all the time, and would do if the Russians came.
Yeah.
And in the Second Gulf War, we expected to do a lot of river crossings because the army was going to go in from the north of Iraq rather than the south, as we eventually did. And again, lots of river crossings anticipated. And everyone went back to how the Germans had done it in 1940. So there's a utility of military history, and that's the sort of next stage. It's not just collecting things, it's walking the ground, getting inside the mind of those fighting a particular campaign, and then looking at its utility for today and tomorrow. And that's what I found sort of so exciting. And we tend, you and I would tend to look at the Second World War maybe because it's the most recent, it's the best documented, the veterans are still with us, just Captain Tom and his generation. But there's another thing, and Richard is simply the latest individual in a thread of people. So he learned a lot of his history at Sandhurst from the head of the War Studies Department there called Peter Young, who was a brigadier and a very famous commando in the Second World War. Peter Young founded the Sealed Knot, English Civil War reenactors.
Yeah.
And he learnt from him that actually reenacting is a very respectable approach to doing military history.
Yeah.
Because you put on a uniform and you handle the weapons and you get blisters, as our antecedents did. And so how can you really talk about Waterloo or being a cavalryman at Naseby or Marston Moor without actually picking this stuff up and handling it, and someone with a horse and a sword charging at you, and you having to pick up a brown bess and fire this thing with an enormous cloud of smoke that obscures your view at the oncoming threat, all of that. And so that's what something else that we picked up and just makes the whole business of military history incredibly exciting. But it has a relevance because soldiers don't change. And John Keegan wrote a very good book called The Face of Battle, which is seminal, and anyone who hasn't read it really needs to. And he drew a line between a soldier at Agincourt, a soldier at Waterloo, a soldier on the Somme, and said they're all the same people. They have the same hopes and fears and anxieties, and they respond to good leadership, and they will stay in places that will almost certainly get them killed because they're there to help their mates. And that's what regimental spirit is all about. And in each case, if you boil things down to the individual person, you need to know what makes them tick, because in a lot of those battles, if you fed all the factors into a computer, they would say, Brits lose, go home, make a cup of tea. And yet the Brits win, and quite often with inferior numbers. And you have to ask the question why. And it's because of that, the essence of leadership quite often, but training, regimental spirit, whatever it is. And that's what military history is about, as much as collecting the badges and the uniforms and the buttons.
Yeah, I echo the sentiments. I used to be a reenactor, so I love to hear when someone of your caliber is saying that they were important, because when I did it, one of the best things I ever did, when I did it.
I'll give you another insight, which is that my grandfather was commissioned into the North Staffordshire Regiment as a territorial officer before the First World War. So he joined in 1912, and in 1915 he found himself as a captain in charge of the machine guns in the 1st 5th North Staffordshire Regiment. And he witnessed the first day of the Somme, with the 46th North Midland Division, and then Ypres, and then was right at the finish at the bridge at Riqueval, which is where the 137 Staffordshire Brigade broke through the German defences of the Hindenburg Line. So he was at several iconic battles. He survived. He was awarded a military cross, as indeed was his brother, who also came through all right. And he left me his diary, which he kept illegally all the way through the First World War. His wardrobe was still there, with his uniforms hanging up, including his First World War service dress.
Wow.
So occasionally that goes back to the Somme with me, where it was worn for real by my ancestor, whose diaries I've also got, and photographs and everything. So he was the mainstay of the sort of regimental old comrades in the 1930s, 1940s. And so he was in charge of sort of everybody gathering together, and they did a battlefield tour of their own of the Somme and the Ypres area and other places in the 1930s. And I've got photographs of how the battlefields changed and altered. And of course, I know them now. So that's another really interesting way of looking at sort of conflict and battlefields. And that gave me an enormous sort of insight as to how they altered and changed. When I first went to Normandy, it was in 1975 as a 14-year-old schoolboy with some friends who owned Second World War military vehicles, so reenactors, which was a very uncommon thing then.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And, the first person I met was Bill Millin on Sword Beach, walking up and down and playing his bagpipes. We were in a convoy of 200 military vehicles riding around Normandy, and we finished at Falaise over the course of 2 weeks. And we had 14 Normandy veterans with us, including half of them who'd actually landed on D-Day itself and were driving these vehicles because it wasn't that much earlier. So Bill Millin, bless him, was the age then that I am now. And again, he took me under his wing and just sort of said, I don't know why I did it, really silly. But here I was. This is my patch of sand. This is where I played my bagpipes and all the rest of it. So I met a lot of these wonderful veterans at an age when I was old enough to appreciate what they meant and to interview them. And they were young enough to be, not gaga or anything, but, have really clear recollection. So, privileged. And I do feel that they, one of my roles as a historian is you're a storyteller. You're a teller of factual stories. And other people have handed this torch to you, which is quite sacred. And your job is to hand it on to other people.
Of course.
And that's what Richard Holmes was so good at doing. And that's why I like to feel I've taken on some of his mantle. You couldn't quite ever walk into his shoes completely. But if you're communicating to another generation what this means and its relevance, then I think that's a hugely valuable thing.
So the third question is the hardest or the most challenging part of your profession?
Okay, so there are several bits to what I do. One is lecturing. Another is guiding people over the ground in the form of a battlefield tour or a staff ride. Another is doing television stuff and obviously writing. And I think the most challenging thing now is because the veterans are few and far between. Now I've had I've probably spoken to 1,000 veterans of the Second World War, and maybe as many again of other wars and battles. And joining the Territorial Army and the Regular Army was very important for me because it was at a time when we tripped into to operations in Bosnia. So I found, all of a sudden I entered a war-torn zone. I saw refugees. I saw, villages in Bosnia that have been torn apart. The trench lines, abandoned tanks were still there. So I got a flavour of what the First World War areas of France and Belgium were like immediately afterwards, and indeed Normandy, once the fighting had moved on. So that gave you a sort of sense of what it was all like. And I think the difficulty is twofold. One is bringing that alive to people at home who have no idea. So when I went back on leave from Bosnia and when I came back, and then I also went to the Second Gulf War, I was the official historian in Iraq in 2003. And indeed, I went over to Afghanistan as well. It's very difficult communicating what you've seen or been part of to people, gentlemen of England now abed, people back home who have no idea of what this was like, what the military fraternity are doing on their behalf, away in miserable conditions.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that you're trying to do. And another is when you're telling the story, when you're writing your bits and pieces, you're cross-referencing other people's memoirs and writings. And they never line up. And what you're being is that solicitor or barrister in the courtroom. And what you've got are several different eyewitness accounts, but they're never, ever going to be the same because people are looking at it from different points of view. Yeah. And that's a real challenge because you don't have the people. You've just got what they've written. Different accounts don't corroborate sometimes.
Yeah.
And is someone telling the truth, or are they mistaken? Or are they writing this in old age because this is 40, 50 years after the event, and are they confusing several things? And you find this with the best will in the world. We probably all remember the last soldiers of the First World War telling their stories. Sometimes it didn't make any sense. because actually what they were telling you was the history books they had read rather than their own reminiscences. And that's the real challenge. So one of the most difficult things I think about being a historian is sensing the veracity of the material you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Which is it's a real challenge, because very few people are getting things wrong deliberately, trying to tell you a tale. But people get confused with old age, and the closer to events things are, the easier it is.
So the fourth question: the proudest moment of your career.
Goodness me, well, lots of those. I can say that when I was asked to take Prince Edward, the Earl of Wessex, and his wife Sophie on a battlefield tour of Normandy, which is about 15 years ago now, and I rolled up to his house and found actually it was just the three of us, and we were going for, what was it, 4 days and 3 nights.
Wow.
And 2 bodyguards as well, in a chase car. And I'd had to organise this whole thing slightly in the dark as to who I was taking, and there was a security aspect, but I was still kept in the dark as to what was going on. So that, very, very pleased to have the opportunity of sort of trying to bring that alive to their Royal Highnesses, without letting the awe of the occasion overwhelm one, and just trying to level with them, and bring them all my insights. So I was enormously pleased and proud to have done that. And actually, I've since done that with numerous politicians and other leaders from other countries. In fact, that's one moment. I think there are all sorts of times when one meets a veteran who underlines a point that you've studied or ground that you've walked, and I'm enormously proud of my association with anyone who's fought really in the Second World War or First World War, any veteran, because it's not about me, it's about them.
Yeah.
And so if an interview goes well, or I feel I've gelled with someone, I feel I've taken something away because they've given me something to take away.
Yeah.
And if I feel, and I feel that if I can make sense of that, of another person's life, and I can hand it on to you or anyone who's reading me or watching me or listening to me, that to me is my takeaway. That's what makes me proud. I've done someone else proud. I've done the job that I feel I'm here to do. Which is leaving military history for someone else, making sense of it, and leaving something behind me that we can all benefit from.
I know, I just feel humbled by what we do. When we're able to sort of present these things that these guys did and make sure that they don't fall into obscurity or anything like that. So that's what I enjoy.
Well, I mean, I'm the other way of reminding oneself. I mean, I have to pinch myself every day that this is what I do for a living and I get paid for it.
Yeah.
It's what we do is an enormous privilege.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for.
And a lot of people who have an interest in military history have a proper job, a day job, and this is a bit of light or heavy relief from them, from the family, whatever they do from 9 to 5, or their retirement moments. So it's not something you can take lightly.
No,
we're talking about people's lives here, and quite often the way they laid their lives down. So there is a heady responsibility, and often I'm on a battlefield tour. I might make a joke, and some people will say, "Oh, you can't make a joke in a cemetery or on a battlefield." To which I say, "Well, you don't know soldiers. That's exactly what soldiers do. They have a sense of black humor wherever they are because of the grimness of their situation. And actually, a bit of humor, well deployed, is incredibly relevant because that's how soldiers think and operate."
Of course. Yeah, I always say that the British soldier has got some of the best humour going, and always will have.
Best humour, and you know, also the best swear words, and
Oh,
also,
yes.
you know, they moan and grumble, and the number of times a commander will say, "There's something wrong because the troops aren't complaining," is actually a very valid observation, because you know, if there's that chuntering in the background, there is a sense that everything is normal, because that's what soldiers do.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed from Agincourt or Hastings
Yeah.
or Waterloo. And you know, it's the same wherever we are on operations today, of whatever nationality.
Next question. Misconceptions or assumptions made about your profession?
Well, I think one assumption straight away is it's a hobby for middle-aged white men. It has no relevance to the present day. It has no relevance to feminist studies, and it has no relevance to diversity in the 21st century. So straight away, I would say, you know, this is all encompassing. This isn't a age specific thing. Neither is it a gender specific thing. So more and more, I mean, today we recognize that there are no male or female forces, because there's no such thing as a front line. The enemy are all around you in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it is that forces from around the world will find themselves serving in the future. So it's pointless to say we can't have women combatants at the front, because there's no such thing as a front. And we've gone much further. So we're enlightened now. So we are male and female together, of equal skills and expertise. And therefore it's really invidious to single this out as a male only occupation or profession or art or vocation. So when we look back, more and more, we're forgetting there's a huge female role in the way the armed forces operate, and whether it's wearing uniform, whether it's supporting them, whether it's just being at home writing letters, whether it's working in armaments factories in the two world wars, whether, you know, obviously nursing the wounded and injured. But there's a whole factor that we sort of completely miss out. And then in terms of diversity, I mean, we're not diverse enough yet, but we are getting there. But in both world wars, this wasn't Britain fighting against Germany or Italy or Japan. This was the British Empire, and the British Empire the majority of the British Empire wasn't white.
No.
So we have an army of colour, and that army of colour in the Western Desert, for example, 4th Indian Division, lots of troops from elsewhere, is what is the backbone of Montgomery's 8th Army. It's really important in fighting our way up through Italy. There's a whole French Expeditionary Corps, mostly made up of soldiers from North Africa. There's a Brazilian Expeditionary Corps, which later fights under Mark Clark's 5th Army, which is an entire division of Latin American soldiers. So, you know, this isn't a white war fought in the Second World War at all. And in the First World War, huge numbers of Indian Army soldiers who come over as early as 1940. And of course, from everywhere from what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka, are serving directly under British command in Ypres and on the Somme and elsewhere. So whichever army you look at, whichever war you look at, this is a very diverse organization, and always has been. I'm about to start writing a regimental history of the Queen's Dragoon Guards, the Welsh Cavalry. You will know them very well. And they have found a painting that was commissioned right at the end of the 18th century, and it has a black drummer in it who was born in Jamaica and joined the then King's Dragoon Guards of his own volition as a trumpeter. So we have always been an army of colour until recently. Those who wrote about it themselves were white, and they wrote about white people. So I think, you know, the responsibility to paint things in and to write and observe and record things in a more natural 21st century way is a responsibility that lies very heavily on our shoulders. It's not artificial, and it's something I care deeply about, to make this as inclusive an understanding of past military history as possible.
Some fantastic insight there. So the last question I'd like to ask you, Peter, is tell me what it means to you to be a historian.
Yeah, I sort of tripped over this a little bit earlier. I am a torchbearer. I am blessed with an ability to communicate. I'm lucky enough to do this, and for people to publish me and people to come along and ask me questions. And I'm very honored that people like to buy my books. But it's not about me. And it is handing down, the wisdom that other people have given to me. When I was at school, I studied history for O-level and A-level. And in those days, world history stopped in 1914 and British history stopped in 1939. So the two world wars weren't taught, and I felt very shortchanged. So I was self-taught in both. And I learned, I learned a lot of things that I didn't think were directly relevant to military history, British constitutional history, the prime ministers, and so. And of course, all of a sudden, they are relevant now. All the nuts and bolts that are there that you pick up in, whether it's history, whether it's science, whether it's geography, whether it's politics, whether it's law, whether it's religion, whether it's English literature, and I did a lot of classical studies and ancient history as well. It all comes together in the mix. And if you're studying what we study, and what those listening and watching are interested in, actually it's a fusion of all the human disciplines. You need a bit of physics to understand the way weapons work. You need a bit of chemistry to understand the way shells and high explosive works. You need a sense of geography and international relations just to get the geopolitics of why we go to war and where we go to war. You need that sense of philosophy to understand the nature of war, and that people like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz have been writing about what war is for hundreds of years. I've met people who say, well, I only do the First World War. They're in the trenches in every possible way. And I think, they're shortchanging themselves, because every senior commander in the First World War has been a junior commander in the Boer War. So you need to know their hinterland, where they come from, why they rose to the heights they did. Most of the developments technologically in the First World War have already been exposed in the Russo-Japanese War. And a lot have also come from the American Civil War, barbed wire, trenches. You can show a picture of the famous trench lines before Petersburg in the American Civil War, where you've got a trench line, craters, barbed wire, dead soldiers and muskets lying around, and say, what is this a picture of? And many people will say the First World War, might be Verdun, might be Passchendaele. And when you say, no, this is 1860s in America, this is the American Civil War, you suddenly realize the sort of continuity.
Yeah.
So all of that sort of comes into the mix. So, military history is a fusion of almost every single human discipline. And if you're going to study it for the future, or you are studying it now, actually, it's a mixture of everything you've already tripped over in school, university, or in, whatever civilian profession you have. And it's incredibly relevant to the profession of arms. Anyone who is in the services, has been or will go into the services. I think military history today is more important than ever, because you are often going to end up in the middle of nowhere in a country that you'd never even heard of, with a culture you don't understand, where people eat odd food, a language that you don't understand. And you've got to make sense of this and keep the peace, or operate in some way or other, and improve people's lot. And there's no textbook as to how to do this. So all we've got is the past. All we've got is what people have done before. And I think, further than that, we all have crises in our career, and it may be it may be a personal crisis at home, it may be a business crisis, it may be something at work, whatever it is. And there's a great inclination then to curl up and just say, oh, I can't carry on, I can't cope with this. Or, to despair because you can't see a way out. And I think when we look back at British soldiers at Dunkirk, or German soldiers in Stalingrad, or American soldiers battling their way through some awful bit of jungle in the Pacific, or Australians doing the same. Any war, any battle, Romans beleaguered in some context, a load of Spartans at Thermopylae. If they can survive, if they can find a way to battle through, then so can you.
Yeah.
Because the story of military history is the story of a lot of people who survived in unlikely odds. And I think that's a very good lesson to us today. We're in a very uncertain era that makes people, very, very nervous. And if you can take away something by looking back at the past and saying, God, these people survived in really unlikely odds, that's really helpful for us. I met in Normandy a German officer called Hans von Luck, and he was a senior officer in the 21st Panzer Division. A lot of people know the name. And in the 1980s, he used to do staff rides in Normandy for British Army officers. And we would ask him questions about his life. And, he'd served in 1940 under Rommel as the reconnaissance battalion commander. He'd been in the Western Desert. He was in Normandy in 1944. And he ended his war in fighting the Russians and was captured and spent 10 years in a Russian prisoner of war camp in a gulag.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm in a really tight spot and I'm having a moment of crisis and despair, I turn to Hans, who I spent many evenings in the bar with, and just sort of say, what would you do? And there was a man who always found a way out of a problem. He spent 10 years in a Siberian gulag, so he taught himself Russian.
Wow.
In Normandy in the Second World War, he taught himself French, and he had a French girlfriend. And in 1950s Germany, when he got out of his Russian prisoner of war camp, life was pretty dire, and so he became a coffee dealer in Latin America because he picked up a bit of Italian in the Western Desert from the Italians. And there was a born survivor. And into his 80s, I can remember him. He would be the last person to leave the bar. He'd have a waitress on either lap in his 80s. He wore slightly too much aftershave. He could drink anyone under the table, and he could converse around the room in English, German, French, Italian, Russian, which embraced almost anyone. And you never ever forgot him. And those are the kind of people who are, really impose their personality in a crisis on a battlefield. And they're great metaphors for, our own lives. They make a difference. And if you can take away a little bit of their gold dust, their magic, and apply that to your own life, then, that to me is the relevance of military history. Because it isn't something for dull, dusty volumes in a library. It's relevant to absolutely every walk of life today.
Thank you again, Peter, for agreeing today. It's such wonderful to hear your anecdotes, hear your answers. It's so much we can take away from that.
Robbie, that was great. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a huge pleasure. And you do this so well. And I love your backdrop of Montgomery's caravan.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.